September 22 end, 1943, 0740 hours. Kofjord, deep in occupied northern Norway, roughly 70 miles inside the Arctic Circle. Beneath the surface of the fjord, at the very base of the largest and most heavily defended anchorage the German Navy possessed, a submarine barely 51 feet long and less than 6 feet in diameter maneuvers into position directly under the keel of the battleship Tirpitz, 42,900 tons of German steel, the largest warship ever built by any European navy, armed with 8 15-inch guns and protected by armor up to 13 inches thick, ringed by anti-torpedo nets, guard ships, hydrophone listening posts, and thousands of men whose entire purpose is to make sure nothing smaller than a full-sized warship can ever get close enough to threaten her. The submarine beneath her keel carries a crew of exactly 4 men, seated almost shoulder to shoulder in a hull so cramped that none of them can stand upright, and 2 side cargoes packed with 2 tons of Amitol explosive between them. Timed charges she is about to release directly onto the seabed beneath the most powerful battleship in the German fleet before withdrawing, if she can, back out through nets, minefields, and patrol boats that have already caught and destroyed 2 of her 5 sister craft in the preceding 48 hours. British naval intelligence, and for that matter, most of the Royal Navy's own senior officers, had spent 2 years doubting that a vessel this small could accomplish anything against a target this large. In the next hour, 6 tons of underwater explosive detonate beneath Tirpitz's hull, and the most powerful battleship afloat is taken out of the war for the better part of 6 months without a single conventional warship ever coming within range of her guns. This is how 4 midget submarines, each one smaller than the torpedoes some full-sized submarines carried, crippled Hitler's last battleship. The threat Tirpitz posed had shaped British naval strategy since the moment she entered service in February 1941, and it was a threat measured less by what she actually did than by what she permanently forced the Royal Navy to prepare against. Sister ship to Bismarck, sunk in May 1941 after a chase across the North Atlantic that had tied down virtually the entire British home fleet for the better part of a week. Tirpitz displaced roughly 42,900 tons fully loaded, mounted 8 15-inch guns and 4 twin turrets capable of firing a shell weighing over 1,700 pounds to a range in excess of 36,000 yards, and carried armor up to 13 inches thick on her main belt. A scale of protection that made her effectively immune anything short of another battleship's main armament or a very fortunate torpedo hit in exactly the right place. From January 1942 onward, she was based in the fjords of northern Norway, positioned precisely to threaten the Arctic, convoys carrying tanks, aircraft, fuel, and munitions from Britain and the United States to the Soviet Union through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. Convoys that had already suffered catastrophic losses to U-boats, aircraft, and surface raiders operating from the same Norwegian bases. Tirpitz herself fought remarkably few actual engagements throughout her entire career. A single largely ineffective sortie against convoy Pick 12 in March 1942. And a bombardment of the Allied weather station at Spitsbergen in September 1943. But her mere presence, sitting at anchor in a heavily defended fjord, achieved something no amount of active combat could have matched. The Admiralty could never risk sending a convoy through Arctic waters without keeping enough heavy units in reserve to counter Tirpitz should she sortie, tying down battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that Britain desperately needed elsewhere, on convoy escort duty in the Mediterranean, in preparation for operations against Japan. Winston Churchill himself described the ship in a memorandum to his chiefs of staff as a target whose destruction or crippling would be a great achievement, noting explicitly that the entire strategic situation in northern waters turned on the shadow the single vessel cast over every convoy that sailed. Conventional means of attacking her had already failed repeatedly and expensively. Carrier-based airstrikes struggled against the mountainous terrain surrounding her anchorages, which blocked radar and low-level bombing runs alike, and against the extensive smoke-generating equipment installed around Fogarty, specifically to blanket the ship in artificial fog within minutes of any air raid warning. Conventional submarine attack was effectively impossible, since Tirpitz's anchorages were protected by multiple layers of anti-torpedo netting strung across the fjord, moored minefields, and a screen of patrol vessels and hydrophone listening posts, specifically positioned to detect any full-sized submarine attempting to approach. The weapon the Royal Navy eventually turned to had originated almost accidentally, from private initiative rather than official planning, and for most of its early development, senior naval officers regarded it with something close to open skepticism. The concept of the midget submarine, sometimes called an X-craft, had been championed from 1940 onward by a small group of officers, most prominently Commander Cromwell Varley and Lieutenant Commander Godfrey Place's eventual commanding officers, who argued that a vessel small enough to slip beneath anti-torpedo nets and shallow enough to navigate minefields designed to stop full-sized submarines could deliver an attack that no larger vessel could physically execute, regardless of how well defended the target's anchorage otherwise was. The Admiralty's own submarine service, an arm of the Navy that had spent decades building larger, more heavily armed boats capable of extended independent patrols across entire oceans, viewed the concept with considerable institutional suspicion. A submarine barely 51 feet long, with a crew of only 4 men in the operational X-craft design, carrying no torpedoes and no conventional weapons of any kind, seemed to many experienced submariners like a vessel too fragile, too limited in range, and too vulnerable to accomplish anything beyond getting its crew killed for very little strategic return. Early trials did nothing to fully dispel that skepticism. The X-craft program suffered a serious setback in June 1943, months before the operation against Tirpitz, when the prototype vessel X-3 was lost during training, with the deaths of several crew members, a tragedy that reinforced doubts in some quarters about whether the entire concept was viable at all, let alone ready to be risked against the single most heavily defended target in the entire Kriegsmarine. The X-craft design itself reflected an almost brutal set of engineering compromises, every advantage purchased at the direct cost of something else a conventional submarine would never have sacrificed. Each vessel measured just under 51 feet in length and displaced roughly 30 tons submerged, a fraction of the size of even the smallest conventional attack submarines then in Royal Navy service. Propulsion came from a single diesel engine for surface running and an electric motor for submerged operation, giving the craft a maximum submerged speed of barely 6 knots and a surface speed not much greater. Figures that made independent transit across open ocean to a target hundreds of miles away entirely impractical on the X-craft's own power and battery endurance. The solution, itself an innovation born of necessity, was to tow each X-craft behind a full-sized conventional submarine for the majority of the journey. The midget submarine's own four-man crew, one of them, typically a volunteer diver trained to exit the vessel underwater through a purpose-built wet and dry compartment, remaining aboard for the tow in cramped, exhausting conditions, while a passage crew aboard the towing submarine handled the operational transit, the two crews swapping places only once the X-craft neared its release point close to the target. Internally, the four-man operational crew, a commanding officer, a first lieutenant who also served as diver, an engineer, and a fourth crewman, worked in a space so confined that none of them could stand fully upright at any point during an operation that, in the case of the Tirpitz attack, would ultimately last well over 60 hours from departure to return. The vessel's offensive punch came not from torpedoes, but from 2 large detachable explosive charges, known as side cargoes, mounted externally along the hull. each one containing roughly 2 tons of amytal explosive fitted with the time delay fuse. The tactical concept was as simple as the engineering that enabled it was intricate. Navigate beneath the target's hull, release both charges onto the seabed directly under the ship, set the time fuses, and withdraw before the charges detonated, relying on the target's own displacement and the shape of the seabed beneath her to concentrate the explosive force directly upward into her keel. Precisely the kind of underwater shock damage that heavy belt armor, designed to defeat shells and torpedoes striking the side of the hull, offered essentially no protection against at all. Before we get into the operation itself, if you're finding this deep dive into Royal Navy history interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. Operation source: the plan to attack Tirpitz along with the battlecruiser Scharnhorst and the pocket battleship Elzo, all three anchored in the same general area of northern Norway, called for 6 X-craft, X5 through X10, each towed by a full-sized conventional submarine across roughly 1,000 miles of open sea from their base at Loch Cairnbawn in Scotland to a release point off the Norwegian coast, from which the midget submarines would proceed the final leg of the journey, through the fjord system and past the anchorage's defensive screens, entirely under their own limited power. The passage across the North Sea, conducted submerged and on the surface in alternating stages over several days, beginning on September 11, 1943, proved almost as dangerous as the attack itself. X-8E's tow was lost when the towing cable parted in heavy seas, and after a series of mechanical failures involving her side cargoes, one of which detonated prematurely at a safe distance from the vessel, causing damage that made the craft unsalvageable. She was scuttled by her own crew, who were recovered safely by the towing submarine. X-9 was lost entirely with all hands when her tow cable parted, and the vessel and her passage crew, 3 men aboard for the transit leg, sank without trace. The wreck never located, and the exact cause of the loss never definitively established. Of the 6 X-craft that had set out, only 4, X5, X6, X7, and X10, remained to continue toward the Norwegian coast and the release point from which the operational crews, transferred from their towing submarines in a hazardous open sea exchange conducted in darkness and difficult seas, would take the midget submarines on the final and most dangerous leg of the journey alone. The approach into Kofjord itself, beginning on the night of September 20th into the 21st and continuing through the following day, tested the X-craft design and their crews against exactly the layered defenses the entire concept had been built to defeat. Kofjord was protected by a substantial anti-torpedo and anti-submarine net that stretched across the fjord's entrance, backed by minefields, a screen of picket boats and patrol vessels conducting regular sweeps, and hydrophone listening posts specifically positioned to detect the sound of submarine propellers in the confined waters of the fjord. X-10, commanded by Lieutenant Kenneth Hudspeth, suffered a series of increasingly serious mechanical failures during the approach, including problems with her periscope and compass that made accurate navigation toward the target essentially impossible. And after extended efforts to repair the faults, Hudspeth made the difficult decision to abandon the attack and withdraw, ultimately scuttling the vessel offshore after recovering her crew, who were picked up by one of the towing submarines waiting at the rendezvous point. X-5, commanded by Lieutenant Henty Creer, was last confirmed in the vicinity of the anchorage during the attack itself, but was subsequently lost with her entire crew of 4. Her fate never conclusively established, though a wreck consistent with an X-craft was later located and is generally believed to be X-5, likely destroyed by depth charges or gunfire from German defenders, who had by then been alerted to the presence of underwater craft in the fjord, that left 2 X-craft to actually reach and attack Tirpitz directly. And their approach, in the hours before dawn on September 22 and 1943, required a level of precision and nerve that the entire preceding 2 years of skepticism about the midget submarine concept had never fully anticipated. X-6, commanded by Lieutenant Donald Cameron, succeeded in penetrating the anti-torpedo net protecting Tirpitz's anchorage through a gate that had been left open, briefly, for the passage of a German patrol boat, slipping through in the boat's wake before the gate closed again. Once inside the net enclosure, X-6 suffered a series of near-catastrophic problems, briefly running aground, losing her periscope to damage, and at one point surfacing accidentally close enough to Tirpitz that she was actually sighted by lookouts aboard the battleship, who reported an unidentified object in the water, but, in the confusion of the moment, failed to immediately recognize it as an enemy submarine or to react in time to prevent Cameron from continuing his approach. Working now almost entirely from memory and dead reckoning rather than periscope observation, Cameron brought X-6 beneath Tirpitz's hull and released both side cargoes onto the seabed directly under the ship's forward turrets, before setting the time fuses and attempting to withdraw, with his vessel now taking on water and increasingly difficult to control, and German crewmen aboard Tirpitz finally alerted to the presence of an intruder and beginning to fire small arms and drop hand grenades into the water around the ship in an attempt to damage or deter the submarine. Cameron made the decision to surface X-6 rather than risk his crew's lives attempting a submerged withdrawal in a badly damaged vessel, and surrendered to the German sailors, who quickly took the 4-man crew prisoner, scuttling the vessel themselves before capture to prevent her capture intact. X-7, commanded by Lieutenant Basil Place, followed a similarly harrowing path into the anchorage, becoming entangled in the anti-torpedo netting on more than one occasion during her approach, and requiring considerable time and skill to work the vessel free each time without alerting the defenders to her presence. Place eventually succeeded in bringing X-7 beneath Tirpitz's hull as well, releasing his own 2 side cargoes at a position beneath the ship, roughly amidships, a placement that, combined with Cameron's charges forward, meant Tirpitz now had 4 separate explosive charges, a total of roughly 4 tons of amytal, resting on the seabed beneath different sections of her hull, all set to detonate within the same narrow window of time. X-7 also became entangled in the netting during her attempted withdrawal, and Place's crew spent a considerable and extraordinarily tense period working the vessel free before the charges beneath Tirpitz were due to detonate, an outcome that, had it occurred while X-7 remained trapped directly beneath or immediately alongside the target, would very likely have destroyed the midget submarine and killed her crew instantly. T approximately 0812 on the morning of September 22. The charges detonated in rapid succession beneath Tirpitz's hull. The effect was immediate and catastrophic to the battleship's fighting capability, even though not a single external mark from the explosion was visible on her hull from any distance, since the entire force of the blast had been directed inward and upward through the water, rather than against armor plating designed to resist exactly that kind of impact. The massive underwater shock wave lifted the 4,290-ton battleship bodily in the water, an effect witnesses aboard Tirpitz herself described as feeling as though the ship had been struck from beneath by something vastly larger than any torpedo, buckling hull plating along significant sections of her bottom, tearing machinery from its mountings throughout multiple compartments, and causing extensive flooding in several areas below the waterline. All 3 of her main turbine sets were thrown out of alignment by the force of the shock, rendering the ship immediately incapable of getting underway under her own power. One of her main gun turrets, Caesar turret aft, was lifted bodily from its mounting ring by the force of the blast, and rendered completely inoperable, its massive turntable mechanism damaged beyond any possibility of field repair. Auxiliary machinery, generators, pumps, fire control instruments, and a wide range of other essential systems throughout the ship suffered damage from the violent shock transmitted through her own structure. and German damage control parties spent the following hours simply establishing the full extent of what had happened to a ship that, moments before, had appeared entirely undamaged and had shown no external sign of the attack that had just crippled her. The strategic effect proved every bit as significant as the physical damage itself. German engineers who surveyed Tirpitz in the days following the attack concluded that the ship would require an extended period in a proper dockyard facility with heavy lift capability to fully repair the damage to her hull, machinery, and gun turret, repairs that Norway's limited naval infrastructure could not provide, and that would require either bringing specialized equipment and personnel to the ship's anchorage or moving her back to Germany, itself an operation fraught with risk, given the Royal Navy and RAF's ability to attack a battleship attempting to transit open water. In the end, temporary repairs were conducted in place using equipment and materials brought north specifically for the purpose, and Tirpitz remained out of active operational service for approximately 6 months, until roughly March 1944, unable to sortie, unable to threaten Arctic convoys, and unable to fulfill the strategic function that had justified the Royal Navy's continued dedication of scarce heavy warships to counter her presence throughout that entire period. For 6 months, the single ship whose mere existence had tied down a meaningful fraction of Britain's available naval strength sat immobilized in a Norwegian fjord, her crew and Germany's naval engineers working to restore machinery that 4 men in a submarine smaller than many of Tirpitz's own boats had reached beneath a defensive screen specifically designed to make exactly this kind of attack impossible. The 6 X-craft that had set out from Scotland, only X-10 survived the operation intact. Her crew recovered safely after the abandoned attack, though the vessel herself was ultimately scuttled during the return transit after further mechanical problems made towing her home impractical. X-5 was lost with all hands, her precise fate still not fully established with certainty even decades later. The crews of X-6 and X-7 fared differently depending on individual circumstance. Cameron's entire crew aboard X-6 survived and was taken prisoner by German forces, spending the remainder of the war in prisoner of war camps. Place's crew aboard X-7 suffered greater losses. The vessel, badly damaged during her prolonged entanglement in the anti-torpedo netting, ultimately could not be recovered, and of her 4-man crew, only Place himself and 1 other crewman, Sub-Lieutenant Robert Aitken, escaped the sinking submarine using emergency breathing apparatus and reached the surface alive, where they too were taken prisoner. The remaining 2 crew members were lost. For their actions, Lieutenant Donald Cameron and Lieutenant Basil Place were both awarded the Victoria Cross, the citation specifically recognizing the extraordinary skill, endurance, and determination required to bring their vessels through the fjord's defenses and complete an attack against a target that had been, by every conventional naval calculation, considered essentially unreachable by underwater assault of any kind. Tirpitz's story did not end with Operation Source, and the ship's eventual destruction, roughly 14 months later, reinforced rather than diminished the significance of what the X-craft attack had accomplished. Once repairs were sufficiently advanced to allow limited operation, the battleship became the target of a further series of attacks throughout 1944, beginning with Operation Tungsten in April, a carrier-based fleet air arm strike that scored several bomb hits and inflicted additional damage and casualties without achieving a decisive result, followed by several further carrier strikes through the summer that were repeatedly frustrated by the same smoke screening defenses and difficult terrain that had complicated earlier air attacks. The final blow came from RAF Bomber Command rather than the Royal Navy, in a series of raids conducted by Avro Lancaster bombers of 617 and 9 squadrons, the same units that had developed and refined the use of the enormous Tallboy deep penetration bomb against precisely this kind of heavily protected, high-value target. An attack in September 1944, Operation Paravane, scored a hit that caused further serious damage. And finally, on November 12, 1944, in Operation Catechism, a force of Lancasters attacked Tirpitz at her final anchorage near Troms, scoring at least 2 direct hits with tallboy bombs that caused a massive internal explosion, most likely detonating one of her main magazines. The battleship capsized within minutes, taking somewhere between 950 and 1,000 of her crew down with her. The final and complete destruction of the ship, whose crippling, 14 months earlier, 4 midget submarines and their crews had first made possible, and whose damaged, immobilized condition throughout the intervening period had already denied the German Navy the one strategic asset her mere presence at sea had always represented. The broader lesson of Operation Source extended well beyond the specific technical achievement of getting explosive charges beneath a single battleship's hull, significant as that achievement was in its own right. The X-Craft program had been built and pursued in the face of considerable institutional skepticism from senior officers within the Royal Navy's own submarine service, professionals who had spent careers understanding naval power in terms of displacement, armament, range, and endurance, categories in which a 30-ton, 4-man vessel with no torpedoes and a top speed of barely 6 knots, submerged offered nothing that compared favorably to the conventional submarines those same officers had trained on and commanded throughout their careers. What the concept's early champions had understood, and what the loss of X-3 during training and the loss of X-9 and X-5 during the actual operation had done nothing to disprove, despite the very real cost in ships and lives, was that a target's defenses are built specifically against the threats its designers anticipate, and that the most heavily protected anchorage in the world offers no advantage whatsoever against a threat small enough to slip beneath the very defenses constructed to stop something larger. Every element of Kofjord's protection, the anti-torpedo netting, the minefields calibrated to the draft and dimensions of full-sized submarines, the hydrophone listening posts tuned to detect the acoustic signature of conventional submarine propulsion, had been designed against exactly the kind of attack the Royal Navy's own submarine service had spent decades perfecting. And precisely because of that specialization, none of it was fully effective against a vessel small enough, quiet enough, and shallow-drafted enough to operate in the narrow margins those defenses had never been built to cover. The 4 men aboard X-6 and the 4 men aboard X-7, working in conditions of extreme physical confinement for over 60 hours between departure and the moment their charges detonated, succeeded not because their vessels were more powerful than the battleship they attacked. In every conventional sense, they were not remotely comparable, but because the entire concept of the midget submarine had been built from the outset around exploiting exactly the gap between what a target's defenders had prepared to face and what actually arrived beneath their hull in the darkness of a Norwegian fjord, Tirpitz herself, for the entire 14 months between the X-Craft attack and her final destruction by tallboy bombs at Troms, never fired her main guns in anger at another warship again, never sortied to threaten another Arctic convoy, and spent the majority of that period either under repair or operating at reduced capability, a strategic asset the German Navy could point to on paper, but could no longer actually employ as the fleet in being that had justified tying down significant British naval resources for over 2 years. The Admiralty's own post-war assessment of Operation Source concluded, without qualification, that the attack had achieved precisely the strategic effect Churchill's original memorandum had called for, removing Tirpitz as an active threat to convoy operations for an extended period through means that no conventional surface or submarine action had proven capable of delivering, at a cost, in ships and in the lives of the men who did not return, that the Royal Navy judged entirely proportionate to what 4 men in each of 2 51-foot submarines had accomplished against the largest battleship any European navy had ever built. The vessel that German naval engineers had protected with nets, minefields, listening posts, and thousands of men had never been vulnerable to anything the size and scale of Tirpitz herself. She had been vulnerable, in the end, to something smaller than her own boats, crewed by volunteers who understood from the outset that the mission offered them almost no realistic prospect of survival, and who went regardless, because the only defense, a battleship, the size of Tirpitz could never build, was one small enough to stop something the Royal Navy had deliberately built to be too small to notice until it was already beneath her keel.